دلنا نتصاور نسمر دلنا انتحانقر تحاسس بنا تهبتمو ويودي غلبتنا شبوختمو تحاسس بنا تهبتمو ويودي غلبتنا شبوختمو تحاسس بنا تهبتمو ويودي غلبتنا شبوختمو
نهبانا بمعدو برحان كوني تغنتي جو سلمات عبيدني نهبانا بمعدو برحان كوني تخافي سويت من قلبي هوت نازنت مخانيو لا كلام فرد تغنتي جو سلمات ثغيري فانا عاود شيدي ودي عيون تغنتي جو سلمات ثغيري فانا عاود شيدي ودي عيون تتاري قوي من قلبي هو حبار بعذور ናይ ሰላም መሰረት መጽነት ክብረት ዘለዓለም ዘይሃብስ ዘይድምሰስ ዘይሕለም ዘይውዳእ ዘይነጥፍ ቀላይ ሩባ ህይወት የፈፋሪ ማይ ሩባ ህይወት የፈፋሪ ማይ መጽነት ክብረት ንዘለዓለም ዘይሃብስ ዘይድምሰስ ከይሕለም ዘይውዳእ ዘይነጥፍ ቀላይ ሩባ ህይወት የፈፋሪ ጽሩይ ማይ ሩባ ህይወት የፈፋሪ ጽሩይ بهوت نمنبار بسلام ناصنتي مبراك بسلام نرحوا خسانت بفويتا ناصنتي بلان بفتا بهوت نمنبار بسلام ناصنتي مبراك بسلام نرحوا خسانت بفويتا ناصنتي بلان بفتا سلمات مريت رزبة علمين ساعة مختبة أبولا أبو الميدا يربا أو بعي النهر عميبا أبولا أبو الميدا يربا أو بعي النهر عميبا سلمات مريت رزبة علمين ساعة مختبة أبولا أبو الميدا يربا أو بعي النهر عميبا أبولا أبو الميدا نبنبا أو بعي النهر عميبا سلمات مريت رزبة علمين ساعة مختبة أبولا أبو الميدا أبنبا أو بعي النهر عميبا أبولا أبو الميدا يربا أو بعي النهر عميبا سلمات مريت رزبة 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 حقين ساعة مختبة 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 أبولا أبو الميدا يربا أو بعي النهر عميبا سلمات مريت رزبة 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 حقين ساعة مختبة 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 أبولا أبو الميدا
حي شمالي حشمليها أنو كي حين يودنجل تاني سيتود مبليو تيعيد لم أمان ديكل يحدني شتسيلي يكميته أمان نفل يحدني شتسيلي يكميته أمان نفل يحدني شكوسيلي يا حجمة يكميته أمان نفل يا حجمة بودي ما هل للبلي أنو كيحين يودنجل حي شمالي حمالي يا للعيتين ديجل تاني سيتود مبليو تعيد لم ومن ديجل حدنتي حنك توداني نسيو زينك ديجل يحدني شكوسيني وكميته ومن مثل تابي مايو كان كلا كحانو زيك هانمل أيدي كوكيو اللي جاسك من يولد الباكو كرحمل يومين كوكو كي كانك ليك كاهم يوكب يحدني شكوسيلي يا حجمة يكميته أمان نفل يا حجمة يحدني شكوسيلي يا حجمة يكميته أمان نفل يا حجمة يوتمتك كالهدي بود إنك كويك نعيدل إلي لهواني تاني يا رب يسكي كمبل عند السنبيل النمر عالدك يا إنك سنبل صبرت إلى التميتانا أنو يا ننتهي معل نكاحاني تاريخ يكو ومنتي يا حليا بيني شيو تابك يا بيا ولا تنجود سمالي تلقين كتر حالات ما ترتوق حليبانيل دي البات نكو كاموك وكيكو يا أباس نويل يحدني شكوسيلي يا حجمة يكميته أمان نفل يا حجمة بودي ما هل للبلي أنو كيحين يودنجل حي شمالي حمالي يا للعيتين ديجل تاني سيتود مبليو تعيد لم ومن ديجل حدنتي حنك توداني نسيو زينك ديجل يحدني شكوسيني يكميته ومن مثل تابي مايو كان كلا كحانو زيك هانمل أيدي كوكيو اللي جاسك من يولد الباكو كرحمل يومين كوكو كي كانك ليك كاهم يوكب يحدني شكوسيلي يا حجمة كميته هم اللي في حجمة يوتي متكلة البوت الندى كوي كان عيدل إلي لهواني داني يا رب يكيني كنبل أنت سنبيل النمر عالتك يا إنك سنبل صبرت إلى التميتانا أنو يا ننتهي معل نكاحاني تاريخ يكو ومنتي يا حيا بينل شيوتا بقيا ورتي جود سمانيل تلقين كتر حالات ما ترتوق حليبانيل ديكي البات نكو كامو يوكي كويا أبس ميمين
أبزلنا علينا ترغمنا تزرزيرو بزي ودع فتلي حاد غوني الكنا ستينا يتمني خازير كبماي فقري سقاي تفتينا تسكينا نزل عالم زي ورد حدري كم عدد كن حاسب كم عدد سرح تقبري قالنا الكي هقري كبري عبتحماك
Welcome everyone to Reclaim Eritrea's event, Does Voting Even Matter? Many people may think that after they've voted that their job is done, and we're here to discuss other forms of civic engagement that are equally important. We're joined today by 5 panelists to talk about the importance of civic engagement in our communities. Senait Nuguse is an Ethiopian-American organizer and educator devoted to improving the experiences of immigrant and refugee communities from diverse cultural, linguistic, and faith backgrounds through the implementation of culturally responsive and inclusive policy and services. In addition, Senait was recently elected to serve on the SeaTac City Council. Previously, Senait served on the King County Immigrant and Refugee Commission and Seattle Neighborhood Group Board. Next, we have Yoel Haile, is a criminal justice program manager with the ACLU of Northern California. In this capacity, he manages a statewide network of local organizations in 11 of the largest California counties to hold elected district attorneys accountable and advocate for criminal justice reform. He also serves as the political director of the African Black Coalition, a statewide Black youth organization. Yoel helped lead campaigns that resulted in the University of California divesting all of its nearly 30 million in holdings from private prison companies. Someone said I'm giving feedback on my mic. I'm going to unplug and replug. Give me 1 second. Is that better, guys? Yeah. Next, we have Andam Gabagurgish, graduated from Yale with degrees in political science and economics, and received his master's in secondary special education. As a teacher, he worked at a public school in the Bronx that was plagued by violence and poor performance before working at the Equity Project, a middle school in Washington Heights that had a restorative justice model, invested in a dedicated social worker for each grade, and had a no student expulsion policy. Andam ran for election to the U.S. House to represent New York's 16th congressional district. Next, we have Hamdi Mohammed, who's currently running to be the Seattle Port Commissioner. She serves as a policy advisor for the King County Executive Office of Equity and Social Justice, where her job is to advance equitable economic development for King County. Prior to serving King County, she was Deputy District Director for the U.S. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. In this role, she advocated for federal workers impacted by the partial government shutdown in 2019. She helped hundreds of small and medium businesses, software companies, stores, restaurants, nonprofit organizations navigate the impacts of new public policies. By employing her advocacy and leadership skills, she helped save millions of dollars for residents and businesses across King County. And next we have Joshua Tabor. He's the founder of GovTrack and created the site initially as a hobby in 2004. GovTrack uses technology to make the U.S. Congress more open and accessible. Today, they are the leading non-governmental source of legislative information and statistics. Joshua is a software engineer and entrepreneur who also has been a contractor for the United States Congress and the District of Columbia municipal government on improving the publication process of the law. Now we're going to go to our panelists to talk about what issues do you see in your communities that you believe people should be aware of as it relates to civic engagement and advocacy. Senite, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. One of the topics that I was hoping to cover, it's now 2021, as you all know. This past year, 2020, during the pandemic, we had the census, which is a survey that's conducted every 10 years in our country to determine how many people are living in our country, the United States. And so I think, and I work very closely with Hamdi. We're both SeaTac Washington residents in King County. And that was something that we really were working with our communities, in particular our East African communities, to get involved in, right? The census is extremely important. And in terms of determining, federal resources that are coming to our local communities, right? So things that we think about that folks may not know is, how those federal resources are used, such as like school, lunches, determining, the roads and projects, hospitals that come into our communities and serve our local residents. And so in addition to that, the census, the information that's used, it's purely statistical, right? It's determining how many people live there, what languages do you speak, and how many children are in the household. And again, our government uses this data to determine what resources go into your communities. And we had a lot of trouble engaging our community members, particularly the East African community, around completing the census, right? Previously, in 2010, we went door to door, right, knocking, making sure that our families, our community members were ensuring that they were counted. In addition to, to 2020, the political climate was hot. Folks were really afraid to complete the census, right? We had, Trump and, that administration really pushing for a citizenship question to be asked as part of the census. And so folks were really afraid. Our undocumented communities were afraid. Our immigrant and refugee communities were afraid to complete the census. And so sometimes you hear things like the word census and, folks don't want to engage. But when you really understand the impact of what, participating can do, and how that impacts you in your daily life, our future, our next 10 years, the amount of congressional representation that our states get, when you make those connections for our community members, they're more willing to participate, right? In addition to understanding that it is purely confidential, it is purely statistical, non-identifying information. And so just want to make sure that our community is aware and that we are engaged, right? Not just our older members in our community, but our young folks, encouraging their parents to participate, right? I saw while school was conducted virtually, I stay very connected with our local school districts. And I know a lot of kids were working on projects and telling their parents like, hey, Mom, we need resources for our school, and encouraging their parents to complete the census. And so, when we promote that kind of intergenerational involvement as part of our politics, as part of civic engagement, we can do a lot more. And so that is my hope. And so I just really wanted to use this opportunity, since we're talking about numbers, and community involvement, civic engagement. And I think that's kind of how I wanted to kick off talking about the census. So I'll end there and see if anybody has anything else to add. Hamdi, I know we worked very closely around census. If you have anything.
Do you want me to jump in as well, Salam?
Yeah, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Sunai, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Hamdi Mohammed. My pronouns are she and her. And like Councilwoman Naguse said, we did work very closely on census issues in 2020. That's kind of my early advocacy actually started when the census was happening in 2010, and U.S. Congresswoman Jayapal was the executive director of One America. And at that time, we were going door to door and trying to get people to fill out, complete their census, and just trying to get them to participate and understand that process. And what's scary and interesting about the census, it's like it only happens every 10 years. And so like this last count was, we were in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so really trying to reach community and hold meetings the way that we did 10 years ago wasn't the same. So it was really difficult. But now it's done. The numbers are in, right? And so I think the next big thing for folks to really look out for is redistricting. And so depending on that information, and now our state is in the process of discussing who is on the redistricting committees in different states and counties, and every state is picking their committees. And so it's really important that you're just staying engaged and seeing how those lines end up getting drawn, who ends up being your representative. District lines determine who represents you, what party controls one particular area. And so we're paying really close attention to that. And it's an off-year election. That's the other thing, right? There's I think it's about over 300 seats right now in our county or in our state that are up for election. And it's an opportunity for people to get out there and run for office, or to support someone that that aligns with them and they share values with. Off-year elections are really low, especially for communities of color. Our folks, they get the presidential election, right? It's like we want to be able to see federal representation. We're so focused on what happens in the White House and so forth. But really, to me, politics is all local, right? Our school board representatives, our local city councils, those are the folks who determine a lot of the stuff that impact our daily lives. And so off-year elections are just so critical and important for us to really be paying close attention to. And this year I will be on the ballot. I will be running for our Seattle Port Commission. Currently, none of our port commissioners live in South King County, and regional representation matters. I am a resident of SeaTac. SeaTac is home to our, SeaTac Airport. 80% of or 70% of the dollars that are generated for the port comes from the airport, and so that airport community really needs representation on that commission. And the port impacts this community heavily, whether that's noise pollution, whether that's air pollution. There's so many different sort of ways that they impact us. The traffic, the list goes on. And then when you look at the folks who work at the airport, a lot of them are either new Americans or immigrants, and so it's really important that we have port commissioners who are pro workers, who are pro union, and who are really going to center our community. And that's who I'm going to be. I've dedicated my life to that. For the last 15 years, I have worked for all sorts of nonprofits in our area. I'm currently working at the county, and worked for Congress with Congresswoman Jayapal. And so I'm excited to bring my experience and my work experience and lived experience to the Port Commission. And I'd be happy to talk about that and share any other information that you guys may have. But again, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you guys and to engage in this discussion.
Thank you both. Josh, do you want to expand more on the census data?
Sure, I can try. I want to apologize. It was supposed to be a different staff member here with you today, and Amy knows much more about the census than I do. But she sent me a paragraph that she was going to say, so I may read it a little bit. I'll say I'm really excited to be on a panel with folks that have actually run for office as a government accountability organization. I'm usually watching what's happening, but not actually involved myself. And also the census is like one of my favorite government agencies. I'm a kind of data geek, and the Census Bureau publishes so much information about the United States and the people that live here. And it's fascinating. So I've got a tab open, and maybe I can share it and screen share a little bit later, but since this part is a little bit quicker. So Amy wanted me to say that the data on Eritrean American citizens and residents is kind of limited from the Census Bureau because there are limits to how much detail the census can provide when there aren't that many people. But so you can find that from the 2019 American Community Survey, which is one of the Census Bureau's programs or projects, not like a computer program. You can find, so there were 49,355 Eritrean-born people in the United States at the time, plus or minus 7,000, according to the census. Anyway, let me see what else she wanted me to say. Amy also recommended looking at local, regional, and state government information on similar demographics. Every level of government kind of collects similar information, and we'll look at things in a slightly different way.
Thank you, Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Andon, would you like to go next?
Yeah, certainly. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. In terms of thinking about our community's needs, obviously there's always a heightened focus on what's happening in the Horn, right? That's all that we really talk about. And I think, while certainly that's important, it's also important for us, as, all of our panelists have said so far, to focus on what's happening locally and domestically for a whole bunch of reasons. But like, even if we want to center what's happening in terms of foreign policy or what's happening in our region, we're better able as a community to effectuate change back there when everything that we have to deal with here at home is straightened away. And so some of the things I've seen as a teacher and also running, certainly two big issues for all Americans, but particularly Eritreans, is housing and education. And this was even prior to the coronavirus, when now obviously we've seen, just so many people unemployed, lost wages, the crisis that we have in terms of housing unaffordability, rising rent costs is something that really challenges our community. And speaking to what Joshua was just mentioning in terms of that, the survey, the sort of surveys that are done in terms of that the census does, there was a survey that was done in the Seattle community, which showed that amongst East Africans, so it was broken up between Eritreans and Ethiopians and Somalis, that about 87% of these Horn of African folks were renters. And so one of the important things for us to think about in terms of our community is what are the rent protections like locally and statewide, depending where you live, right? I live in New York, and there are pretty strong tenant protections here compared to other states. You know, like California is also pretty good, New Jersey. Washington, for example, Washington State, and I know there are a lot of Seattle people, right? There, as far as I know, right, there's no rent control in Washington State, right? So these are important things to consider when we're talking about a community that, again, if we're using the data that we have for Seattle to sort of make a generalized statement, again, we probably shouldn't do that because the community is going to be different depending on the cities that we're looking at. But we know that we have a lot of people who are renters, and all Americans right now are very much rent burdened. So our community is going to be hit disproportionately by that. So some of the things that we can think about, and maybe we'll talk about this moving forward, is like, what does it look like for us to get involved in tenants associations and organizing our community in terms of whether it's like where we live or with other immigrants around housing related issues. Because again, like if you're living in Washington State and there's just like an absurd rent hike, okay, so you want to retaliate, you want to challenge your landlord or your management company, but you don't want to face retaliation, right? You want there to be a just cause for something that's happened to you, something that's called like just cause eviction, if they're to maybe get more technical. Connected with housing is then education, right? Because housing is an important determinant on one's ability to achieve a high quality education in this country. And there are a whole host of reasons why that is a problematic determinant in America because of how funding goes. But when we think about education, and one of the reasons why the census data is also extremely important, because a lot of times data for African immigrants, and particularly sub-Saharan, I don't really like the term sub-Saharan, but like the sub-Saharan African immigrants, we don't have data on how our community is doing because it's sort of crowded out by this monolithic demographic category that is Black Americans. And we know this is like a very diverse category, particularly within just even African immigrants. So it's hard to, again, sparse it out and say specifically what's happening within the Eritrean community. But looking at, again, sub-Saharan African immigrants throughout the country, we see that we're about, in terms of first generation, second generation children of sub-Saharan African immigrants, it's about 15% of the Black population. And there are a whole host of different educational outcomes that come within this grouping. And so part of the reason why we see this is because, again, there is this is a separate conversation, but there is, again, institutionalized racism and systemic barriers that exist in majority minority school districts for which many of our community goes to school in. But there are also specific and particular concerns that we have that you're going to see in terms of early education, that's going to be heavily prominent in early education. For example, what is the language of the home, right? Like what is going on in your household prior to even entering your early childhood setting, which is going to be a huge determinant for what your educational trajectory is going to look like. And so we can talk about this more, but like what are the types of interventions that we want to organize around within our community to make sure that we're giving everyone the best shot academically. Some of this could be, again, even just having a cognitive shift, which is necessary within America, but to look at folks' innate and their innate and native languages that they're speaking in their home is not a detriment or a sort of pathological barrier to their success in this country, but really as a vehicle which we can use to achieving success academically. And so far, myself as an English teacher, I see that this is a challenge that America has had for a long time, where English is not the de jure language of the country, but it's very much approached that way in terms of education. So there's a lot to talk about there, but certainly within the community, education, there's a high priority, a high premium on education within our community. But sometimes, again, the way it plays out because of systemic barriers, we don't always see the results that we want. So I'm looking forward to talking with solutions with everyone for the next hour.
Thank you, Andon. Yoel?
Hi, sure. Thank you, everybody, and thank you all for having me. Can you all hear me? Great. So the issue that I wanted to talk about is immigration and refugee issues. So I live in Oakland, and one of the main things we face is a lot of like immigrants or refugees who just arrived to the country, who are recent arrivals, usually come to California because it is easier to get asylum in California, kind of in the western end of the United States. And there's two distinct issues that I want to lift for the conversation today. One is on the point of people seeking asylum. There are a couple of things that we're facing that I think we could all kind of work together and see what solutions can exist. But one of the main issues, for instance, is when people come to the States seeking asylum, and they submit themselves to detention at the border. They get sent to different detention centers, throughout the country, in Mississippi, California, Arizona, Alabama, all over the place. And one of the things that's tough about immigration law in this country is that you're not automatically provided an attorney, an immigration attorney, the way you are if you got arrested by the police, right? So if you get arrested by the police and you can't pay for a lawyer, you're provided a government-provided lawyer, which are the public defenders, which work to protect your interests and make sure you have your rights preserved. In immigration, it doesn't work that way. So if you can't afford a lawyer, you're really just stuck in the detention centers until you can find a lawyer to try to get you out and follow up on your case. There are pretty strict deadlines in terms of how the court processes and the asylum process. So me and some of my comrades, what we face a lot of difficulty with is, the lack of immigration lawyers as a whole, but also the lack of good immigration lawyers. You'd be surprised how many terrible immigration lawyers are out there, really exploiting the vulnerability of our people because, your first goal when you're in a detention center is to get out and to try to find a lawyer, and you have no way of knowing who's a good immigration lawyer or not. So a lot of the stuff goes by word of mouth. So, we get a lot of calls from detention centers all over the country, asking us for help to get a good lawyer, a good immigration lawyer, or asking us for resources, funds, so that we can hire good immigration lawyers for the people who are detained and who are seeking asylum. And, the resources we're able to put together are no match to the needs, right? There's way too many people who need representation in order to be able to win on their asylum cases and be released than, we have the funds for, right? And on average, it's about, $5,000, for somebody to represent you in immigration court. And so that's one issue that I think even intercommunally that we have to work through to figure out how can we pull together some funds that can kind of be loaned to people who can then use that money, hire a lawyer, get out, come back, get a job, and then pay that money back to the fund so that it can kind of be cyclical. And then we can kind of have established, pool of funds that we can, and like a network of like pretty good immigration attorneys that we can kind of keep on retainer to be able to provide that service. But because that doesn't exist, the consequence of that for Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers has been prolonged detention, right? So even when, for example, your asylum application gets, let's say rejected and you're ordered removed, which means like, they want to deport you, they're only supposed to hold you for 6 months. And if they can't, deport you within 6 months, the government's actually supposed to release you because at that point is no longer a lawful detention, right? They're supposed to either prove that they're about to deport you or they're supposed to let you out and, wait until they can deport you. And, what we see a lot is that we get calls from people who've been detained for almost 3 years, right? 3 years in detention after the case has been like resolved or, you have no more rights. And at that point, the only thing you can do is file what's called a writ of habeas corpus, which is essentially challenging the government to release you because they have no legal basis to detain you. And those are also they're way more expensive to find a lawyer for you to do a habeas corpus writ than it is just to your regular asylum application. So, in terms of like the consequences of elections and, our kind of engagement as a community around the issue of immigration, it's really, parallel to the loss of like liberty, right? Our failure, I think, either as a community or the failure of the government to provide adequate immigration lawyers is always parallel to the fact of how many people are going to be in detention centers for how long, right? So I think that's one piece. The second piece is this, essentially Trump ban that we've been dealing with. Eritreans have been banned from getting what's called the B1, B2 visas, or the visitor visas, or invitation visas. These are the kind of visas typically people invite their family, their parents, their cousins or aunties for like weddings, special occasions, to come visit them in the U.S. And the Trump administration has banned Eritreans from getting that visa under the auspices of that the Eritrean government is not receiving deportees, and that ban is still in place. When Biden came and rescinded the previous Trump ban for other African countries, other Muslim majority countries, that actually didn't affect us, in a real way. That ban still exists, and I think one of the things I'd love to work with people with and collaborate with, and is how do we leverage our collective power to push the new Biden-Harris administration to actually repeal this Trump ban, and allow Eritrean families to be reunited with their loved ones and with their families here.
Thank you all for your insights. You've done a great job of outlining the issue. And now we're going to talk about the solution. Joshua is going to show us a little bit about GovTrack and share his screen with us.
Great. Give me a moment to just pull it up. Okay. It's loading, right? All right. You all can see my GovTrack screen? Okay, cool. All right. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the things that you can do on GovTrack. So GovTrack is a project that I started a long time ago to track legislation in the United States Congress. We're a small organization. There are only two others of us. So we're not issue experts. We don't know the ins and outs of any particular issue that Congress is working on, but we know how to find the information. And we're trying to teach people how to be the best advocates that they can be for themselves and the issues that they care about. So we're always happy to work with people that are working on important issues. So let's see. So I'm going to start just with what you would do as sort of an individual, and then we'll go towards what GovTrack would do as a tool for helping you advocate for legislation. So I'm just going to start, and we'll look at some basic stuff. So you could start by finding your own representative in Congress. I'm going to type in an address near where I used to live in Philly. And the site will bring up a little map of the congressional district that your address is in, and pointing to where you are. Double check that this is actually where your address is. Sometimes the map comes up with not quite the right location and would be the wrong district. In this case, the map has found the location correctly. It tells you who your two senators are in the United States Senate and who your representative is in the United States House of Representatives. So in this case, my representative, if I still live there, would have been Representative Evans, with a link to his Twitter handle, website, and phone number if you wanted to call. And we have a lot of other information about all of the members of Congress. So one of the most important things to keep in mind when doing advocacy is when they're next up for re-election. So all the representatives are up for re-election every 2 years. For senators, you never quite know. So the last line of the first paragraph tells you that he's up for re-election in 2022, and his current term ends on January 3rd, 2023. And so we pull in official information about legislation and members of Congress from the US Congress. We also do our own data analysis that helps to figure out the context around legislators and legislation. One of our data projects is this little chart, which kind of plots where members of Congress are on an ideological spectrum from liberal to conservative or left to right. It's data. It doesn't necessarily mean liberal and conservative, but it helps to kind of give an idea of where legislators are. So Representative Evans is kind of over here, kind of in the middle left of the Democratic pack, right? This kind of helps you maybe understand if you're looking for a ally on an issue that you're working on, and that issue happens to be a kind of left of center issue or a right of center issue, this might give you a sense of how the representative's opinion might be if you don't have other information. We include some ratings from some major advocacy organizations, again, just to give an idea of what this representative stands for without having to do too much research. And let's see, some bills that they've sponsored that have been enacted, and other bills that they've sponsored. You can see issue areas that the legislator tends to work on. Some information about votes. For advocacy, though, committee membership is really important. All legislation in Congress really goes through committee as the primary place where kind of debate and negotiation happens. And as it turns out, legislators are almost powerless to do anything that is not related to the committees that they sit on. So if you're looking for help from your legislator on a particular issue, if they don't sit on the right committees, so Representative Evans is on the Small Business Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, which has to do with taxes. If you're looking at a different issue, the representative may not really be able to help. You can always write a bill. It may not go anywhere. So let's look at a committee. On our committee page, we have a brief summary of what the jurisdiction is of the committee. So that's what are the policy areas that the committee deals with. And it's really important to know which committees do what so that you can be targeted and make sure you're addressing legislators that work on the area that, or on a committee that works on the area that you care about. So you all mentioned immigration issues, of course. That would probably be, let me scroll up first. So there are Senate committees and there are House committees. So on every issue, there's usually one committee in the House and one committee in the Senate that's relevant. The relevant committees for immigration probably are going to be the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. And if we go to the House Judiciary Committee page, it'll mention that one of its areas of jurisdiction is the Department of Homeland Security, which since the early 00s has been the federal department primarily responsible for immigration issues. So then you would want to get to know the chair, the ranking member, which is the ranking member means the senior most member of the other party, and any other committee members that you think would be helpful. So this is maybe one of the most important starting points for figuring out what to do on an issue. It's who's going to be your ally in Congress. You've got to find some ally. Looking at my list of things to mention. So let's look at bills that might be about Eritrea. So I'm just going to search for Eritrea. And I know because I searched before we began today that there are no bills currently in Congress that contain the word Eritrea, but we can look at some recent ones. Congress works on 2-year cycles that start on odd years. This is an odd year, right? We're only a couple of months in. So there aren't many bills in Congress currently active. So there may be relevant legislation coming up, but we can see some recent ones. And I'm going to sort this list by the most recent legislation first. And let's see, there was one I wanted to look at. Let's see. So let's say the Insure Act of 2020, which was introduced by Representative Omar. So this bill has a short title, which just comes from the bill itself, to defer the removal of certain Eritrean nationals for a 24-month period. So I guess to delay deportation. So you can see what happened with this particular bill in the past. The sponsor, you can read its text, and the text can be kind of wonky. But once you read enough bills, you kind of start to get the hang of it. The status of the bill, so it died when it was introduced in the the preceding Congress. You can get sort of status, and then some background information of just about kind of what we're looking at here. So this was a bill, where this comes from. If you follow the source link here to congress.gov, you can go to the Congress's official page for the same information, which is where we get a lot of the information, and they may have more details than we do to see what's going on. Let's see, as my time dwindles, I wanted to just try out a couple of other things. I wanted to, members of Congress, I wanted to look at the district that Andam ran in. So you can type in NY16 and it will bring up a map of that district. So if you're working on an issue that, you know, is about a particular area or residents of a particular area, you can go look up who the representative is and get a sense of what else is going on in that district. Sorry, I missed the most important thing. So for every bill in Congress, every legislator, every committee, we have a button that says track in green at the top. This will let you get email updates for all these things. So you have to sign up because we need your email address to send you emails. But you can choose if you want to get emails every day or every week, whenever there's something in Congress relevant to what you're tracking. So you can track your 2 senators and your representative. You can track any committees that might be relevant to the issues you care about. You can track all votes and just get an email every time there's a vote in Congress. It's going to be a lot of emails. But that's one of our core things that that we've offered for the last 15 or 20 years. Let's see, I wanted to show, this is just a random bill. On the details tab of bills, you'll see the sponsor and all of the co-sponsors for the legislation. And it shows which co-sponsors are on the relevant committees for this bill. So this is another part of understanding where do you target your energy when you're doing advocacy, and it's always on legislators that are on the right committees for what you care about. So if this were a bill that you cared about, if you want to push it forward or try and prevent Congress from enacting it, looking at the list of co-sponsors and seeing which ones are on a committee that the bill is assigned to, those would be the legislators that you would want to work with on this issue. So this co-sponsor wasn't on any committees, so this representative is not really going to be useful. He's kind of just there for the ride. So I just wanted to say we're really trying to help people be advocates, and I think the 3 or the 4 things I would say about advocacy are: 1, you have to know what's possible. So understanding what committees and Congress can do is one of the first things to think about. Building a relationship with relevant members of Congress and their staff is the second thing. So once you see an issue, go to their town halls, start to meet the staff members, give them a call from time to time. You can just dial up the office and try and talk to a staffer. Learn the process of how Congress actually does the legislation so that you can have a meaningful relationship with the people that you're working with. And then be prepared to stick with it for like 10 years, because Congress is a very slow moving process, and you have to be committed to really get stuff done. So, okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Josh. So many amazing tools on that website. We also created a tool on Reclaim Eritrea's website. I'm going to share with you guys really quick. So we recently launched a Find Your Reps website at reclaimeritrea.com/vote. Similarly, you can find your reps local, county, state, or at the federal level. Put in an address here. I'm going to put in this is an address of a restaurant I love in Arlington. It's called Injera Restaurant. Okay, we're going to look up local reps. And yeah, so all of that information comes up. And a couple of the new tools that we have coming are, we'll be listing polling locations as well as the election schedule.
Oh, there she is.
Lost you guys. Okay. Okay, great. We're going to move into talking about the solution with our panelists. Councilwoman, would you like to go first?
Is that me? Yeah, thanks, Salam. Yeah, no, I think the tools that you, Salam and Josh just presented are incredible resources that our communities definitely should utilize. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, we come in late into these processes, right? When a bill has already been introduced and it's already made its way and already going into legislation. And we as residents, whether, you know, we're citizens or not, have the power to shape these ideas. We can work with our representatives to create these solutions. And so we can do these as individuals or collectively through advocacy, lobbying, participating in our government. As a city council member, one of the things that I've been really doing is trying to get our youth to participate on our commissions, who, you know, advise us as council members what to do, and, you know, how to shape our policies, and really welcoming their input, right? And so we need representation, not just in our government, but in those spaces as well. And so I think this is a really great tool that you have introduced to us, for individuals to, you know, see which pieces of legislation they want to support, or oppose, right? To ask more questions and see what conversations are happening, so that they can provide public input, public comments, and participate in those ways. And so I'm really grateful that you all are showing this tool and have put it on the Reclaim Eritrea website. And again, like, we as elected officials represent and work for our community. And so it's really important that folks are getting involved. And that's where I see kind of a lack in our community is, you know, these spaces, unfortunately, are not typically safe spaces. Like, as a council member, I went in knowing that I was going to primarily serve on a conservative council, right? Whose, you know, those council members did not align with my values or what I believe my community needs are or want. And so these are not safe spaces sometimes, but we have to demand the respect. Our government works for us. Our elected representatives work for us. And we have the power, again, to shape these policies, to shape our government, to be representatives, and more. And so I really encourage our young folks, our older folks, people from different backgrounds, whether you are native born or not, to participate in our government, because at the end of the day, the government works for you. And so I really encourage folks to get involved. As Hamdi said, like, local government is really important. And so in your city councils, your school boards, your water districts, your county councils, those are the things that you see every single day, right? The sidewalks in your neighborhoods, you know, where the parks are placed, you know, where business can be conducted, the types of businesses that are conducted. And so these are the things that you can shape in your community. And so really encourage you to serve in those spaces and to get involved. And so if you don't know where to start, checking out your local websites for your jurisdiction, whether that's city council website, your school boards, looking at advocacy organizations that align with your values, searching your local community-based organizations that are doing work, right? Start volunteering. That's how I somehow ended up here, right? I never intended to be an elected official, but I got here through serving my local communities, my East African community in particular. It was my seniors who somehow pivoted me to come into this role. And then, displacement was happening in our community, primarily East African women business owners were being displaced and didn't understand why, right? It wasn't until I got into this position that I understand how things happen. They don't happen overnight. It's strategic, right? It's the policies that are put into place that are moving things forward, right? And slowly our communities get pushed out and their voices are unfortunately silenced. And so when our community members can get involved at the local level as soon as possible and are advocating and sharing their ideas and shaping our government from the beginning is when we'll see real change happen, right? We'll see more equitable policies, we'll see more representation, and better outcomes overall. So that's what I have to say, and we'll pass it off. Thank you, Salam.
Thank you so much. Also for your service. We appreciate it. Hamdi, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think Sanait summed that up really well. I mean, she gave the examples and the calls to action. So I'll try to build on it a little bit. I think, today you can do advocacy and advocate for your community in any sort of way that you want, right? You could do it from your house. You could use your network and social media, email blasts, things like that. And so there's a way for anyone to really get engaged. And I always tell people, start where you're comfortable, start somewhere, do something, and really using your network and the people that will help you get started. And so that is one that I always tell people. And the other one is just, use your power, right? Like Sanait was saying, you are, whether you're a citizen or not, you're a taxpayer, you live in this country, you contribute one way or another. It's really important that you're holding your elected officials accountable, that you are using your power, that you're reaching out to, your city council members, right? When CTEC City Council is not doing something correctly, Sanait Naguse, someone you can contact, or the other council members. But whatever it may be, use your power, step into it. Do not be afraid of that. And I know it takes time and it's intimidating. You can start by, writing a letter to your member of your council members or other elected officials during their city council meetings or county council meetings. There's always public comment. You can go and share your comments. If you don't want to do it, in person or virtually, you can write in those comments, and it's easy and accessible. And then the other thing is like actually participating when elections are happening, right? The folks who are in office, we put them in office whether we participate or not, right? Your lack of participation also contributes to that. And so really, when there's and again, I'll underscore, off-year elections are important. Those are the ones that we're not talking about. Those are the elections that, impact us the most locally. And so, working to help get more progressives elected is super important. If there are particular initiatives or bills that you're pushing, those are times that, you can put it at the forefront, ask those elected officials or whoever is running for office, whether it's re-election or they're, looking to get elected this round, you ask them, like, what's your stances on housing, right? What's your stances on rent control? And and even immigration. There's a lot that can happen locally around immigration. Our county has done really great things in King County to make sure that we're protecting our immigrant and refugee populations, ensuring that our local government is not participating with federal immigration enforcement, agents, because we know when that happens, a lot of the times people end up being scared to access public health information, to contact, their local law enforcement if there is some sort of like crime or something happens to them. And so we have a code in place that says that unless there's a judicial warrant attached to a request that's coming from our federal agents, then our county shall not share information with them. And that puts real strong protections in place. So, everyone in our community can participate and protect each other. And so there's a lot that can happen there. And yeah, use your voice, use your power, reach out to me if you'd like, or Sinai, or any one of us who are organizing in King County and Washington State. I'd be happy to collaborate and provide any support that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamdi. Yoel, would you like to go into immigration and refugees and what the solution is around that, how people can get involved?
Yeah, sure. So one thing one initiative we're thinking about launching up as a result of the B1, B2 visa ban I mentioned earlier is to put together legislative visits across the country with representatives. So I'm actually really glad that we have some people who used to work for Pramila and tonight in the local. So we would love to collaborate with you, but also anybody, where our community is present. Typically is, we're like in the Bay Area, we're in LA, Seattle area, Dallas, DC, Minnesota, Chicago a little bit. Those are kind of the hot spots where we've settled and where there's a critical mass of Eritreans to be able to push some things together. So one of the things we're thinking about is coordinating a set of visits with the representatives in those areas. One, to let them know that this is something that's in place. It's a Trump ban that's still in place that is preventing family reunifications, and to try to put that on the agenda so that those members of Congress could then put it on the agenda as a priority around the immigration policies and put pressure, on the Biden administration to actually repeal this as soon as possible, so that avenues can be created for more families to be reunited. And then the other pieces around the prolonged detention that I mentioned of asylum seekers who are in detention centers all over the country, who should really be released unless, the government's going to deport them. But otherwise, nobody should be released. And then people should be released on parole or bond, and that if they're going to be released on bond, the bond should be like as low as possible. The range goes, I think, from $1,500 to about $7,500. And, most people, by the time they get to the U.S., obviously they're typically out of resources. So to the extent that people can be released at the lowest bond possible, or, with no bond at all, those are kind of the two issues that we want to build a campaign around that's led by our community. So if there's anybody who's interested anywhere in the U.S. who would like to be part of that effort, please, reach out to me. My email is haileyoel@gmail.com, and those initiatives will be something we're going to be working on for the next couple of months. I'd love to collaborate with all of you and everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoel. Anda, can you go into what the solution is around education and housing, how people can get involved?
Yeah, definitely. Again, just thanks for all the insight from the previous panelists, and thanks, Josh, for creating GovTrack. As someone who was running for office, it really, especially challenging an entrenched incumbent, it really allows you and gives you the resources to be able to hold their feet to the fire on things that they voted on in the past. And I think for our community and really all communities, again, it equips you with really the resources at your disposal to be able to tell your electeds, look, you voted on this in 1994, and this has changed, or this situation is exactly similar, so you should be advocating right by our side on this issue. So thanks, Josh, for going over that. And I think it's, again, an invaluable resource for our community. When it comes to legislation, I think it's important for us to agitate and to advocate on our behalf with electeds. Certainly, there's no panacea. We need to build power within our communities. We need to build civic institutions within our communities that are outside sort of an electoral realm. But I do think that there's a dialogic sort of feedback that exists, right? As we develop and build our own power, we are now better able to speak to electeds and articulate our concerns to electeds, which then feeds back into, again, the institutions that we have in our communities, which makes them even stronger. And so I think when it comes to housing and education, again, for many reasons, I think there are challenges that we face as, if you want to go to the oldest Eritrean American communities, maybe 50 years for folks who came in the 70s on education scholarships. So it's not a long time, especially because those folks did not think they would be here for 50 years. Many of them, and this is an issue with immigrant communities, right? It's the issue of settlement, right? Like for many of our parents' generations, right, they thought that they would go back home at some point. When I say home, go back to Eritrea at some point. And so for a whole variety of reasons, many of them are still here, and they haven't focused as much, again, on concerns here, which now, for those of us who are born here, we're better able to, again, work with them and use the capital and social, cultural capital that they have to be able to fight for that. So when it comes to housing, as I mentioned before, whether it's tenants associations fighting landlords who are making illegal or unjust rent hikes, stealing security deposits, very common, unjust evictions. Here in New York, a big issue was around MCIs, or major capital improvements, that they would do to properties and then put that into the rent when it actually should, that's the management company. Like, you're doing that on your own. Why is this being spilled down to everyone's individual rent? So hopefully within our community, we're able to organize on that. I'm not really an expert on that, but it's something that, just living in New York, it's something that is unavoidable, because it affects everyone. And I know in Seattle, or Seattle area, this is a concern as well. DC, really wherever you are. I mean, even in areas that are not hotspots in the coastal cities, in many ways, the stratification is even worse in those sort of, if you're looking at like the Rust Belt or places in the Midwest, in many ways, it's even worse because the tenant protections are not there like they are in some of the coastal states. In terms of education, again, just really quickly, thinking around building civic institutions, what is it? And some of these already exist, right? Like, there are Eritrean tutoring programs and mentoring programs that exist in different localities. How can we amplify these? How can we make it something that is getting greater support from the wider community? And I think we're better able to do this as, again, more of us enter into these professions and are like, wait, we're not lone wolves here, right? We all have skills that if we, again, come together and work in solidarity with each other, we have a great amount of resources that we can give to the benefit of our community. I think that particularly for immigrants.
You went on mute.
My bad. I'm moving my hands. The Eritrean in me accidentally tapped it. There is an issue depending on parental involvement in terms of like PTA associations. This is not, again, a solely Eritrean issue, but there's a socioeconomic divide. The reason why higher socioeconomic status families many times perform better in schools because their parents have the ability to be much more involved in after school activities and checking in with their homework and communicating with teachers. And so how can we create systems where, like, even if you're working, over 12 hours a day, or you have a night shift because, you're either driving an Uber or you're working as a security guard, how can we have resources in our community to make sure that, all right, this is a village that's raising our children and they're all going to be involved educationally for the children's support. In terms of advocating and looking at bills, I think some of the main things to be looking for in terms of funding, if we're looking on a federal level, again, like I spoke before about like majority minority districts, there's a huge disparity in funding that goes there. Speaking around like culturally responsive and culturally sustaining pedagogy is extremely important, I think, within our community, because there sometimes can be challenging identity issues that are brought up, particularly as we know our parents don't have always, they might not have the capital to be able to speak to us about some of the challenges that we're experiencing here as first generation folk growing up in America. I always like to talk about it like in the sense of W.E.B. Du Bois. He spoke about a double consciousness about being Black and American. I feel like we have a triple consciousness, right? Like existing as both Americans, Black Americans, and Eritreans. And how do we navigate that? So I think there are a lot of things that we can do in terms of advocating, but the most important thing is, again, we can't wait for our electeds to do this for us. We have to build our own power, even if they're not listening and being responsive to us, because when we do that, they'll actually listen to us even more.
Thank you all for your input. We're going to end with a few questions. Anyone can jump in. The first is, so one of the prerequisites for civic engagement as it relates to Eritrea is being familiar with Eritrean foreign policy, or simply knowing what is happening with the situation that's in constant flux. And it can be easy to be confused by the varied information coming out of the region. Where do you get reliable information on Eritrea from? Is Twitter a reliable news resource for you? And anyone can jump in on this question.
I can jump in. There's a lot of noise on Twitter, certainly. So you have to pick and choose. I feel like certain journalists or friends within the community or trusted elders in the community who you can listen to. I mean, I feel like I'm somewhat decently informed about what happens there, but that's largely just because of my family and my parents. Like, you can't avoid a conversation at the dinner table, and you multiply that over 35 years of living, you pick up things here and there. But at the end of the day, like, I was born here, my Tigrinya is terrible. Like, there's going to be limitations to my ability to be able to me personally, like, be able to fully follow everything that's going on, especially when there's so much, if we're talking around like the Tigray conflict and everything going on, so much misinformation that is amplified on social media. So I think it's important for us to like find trusted sources within our community online. There are some that I look to, but there is a lot of misinformation certainly there. But at the end of the day, like, you have to hold on to the values that are important to you, which, like, hopefully for all of us, it's like around human rights and dignity and justice for all. And so even if you see or smell something that feels like it might be just a little bit off, you don't need to have complete information to be able to make a political stance that's rooted in a morality that hopefully we all have. So.
Thank you. And we have a question from one of our audience members. How do we create sustainable funding for our education programs? How do we create sustainable funding for attorneys in order to help our refugees?
I can start on this one. So, part of the challenge is that, we're hiring individual attorneys for individual cases, right? And that is because there's obviously a systematic failure of the federal government not providing, pro bono attorneys or like immigration lawyers for free as you're going through an immigration court system that is very complicated, that is highly technical, and where the system itself is set up for you to lose like your asylum claim if you don't have an attorney, right? It's almost impossible to do that. So, part of the kind of ideas we've been playing with is, and also like from the kind of nonprofit world structure, it's hard to get like donations or grants that will allow you to pay for one case for one individual, right? Because people are trying to have like scalable impact when they're giving grants and donations. So the kind of idea at least the latest idea that we're exploring is, what would it look like if there's 500 of us, or 1,000 of us were to give, let's say $500, right? So if 1,000 of us gave $500, then that could be a pool of money that can be like managed by some sort of trusted nonprofit or any of the non-Eritrean nonprofits that do exist already, to where the people who don't have money to hire a lawyer when they come to the States, they have a hotline they can call, and then that person can then arrange, for the hiring of an attorney. They will be represented when they come out, they'll get a job and they'll pay it within 6 months to a year, and it kind of can circulate, and it's money we control. It's money that we don't have to, we have to answer obviously to our community, but we don't actually have to answer to foundations or other people. And we've seen it work, right? There are people already whom, like, we paid for their immigration attorney. They were able to get out. They're working within 3 months. They've already paid it back, right? Because most people who come here seeking asylum, they're as soon as they're released, they're very quick to get jobs and get settled, because people come here to support themselves and their families. So it actually works, and it's easier for everybody, right? Like, the difference I saw, for example, was there were people who called us like on the eve of their actual immigration hearing, like 2-3 days. At that point, there's really nothing we can do. Like, you can't, even if a lawyer was available, no lawyer would take a case to be able to go before a judge within 3 days, because it's not even enough time to actually prepare for the lawyer, right? Because he's not going to do, or she's not going to do a good job of representing the individual. So, I think the short answer is, I think we have to pull it ourselves, because it gives us the maximum level of freedom to be able to support, and it can be a standing pool of money that we don't have to try to get replenished every year, right? It's kind of like how we do with with the airport, for example, right? It's everybody pitches in, and it's always rotating. Does anybody know what that is? And it's always rotating. So I think that might be the best way to go forward, and at least that's the latest experiment we've been doing.
Thank you, Yoel. And then our last question is, similarly, how do we create sustainable funding for education programs for our communities?
I guess I can chime in quickly. It depends on the type of educational programs we're talking about. I mean, I think within a lot of the volunteer tutoring that's existing, I mean, all of this is, it's volunteer, right? People are professionals taking up, maybe 2 to 3 hours of their week to be able to work with young people throughout the country. So, I think depending on what is needed, it's not actually about having financial resources. I mean, the resources exist within ourselves. It's just a matter of sort of the organization of putting these things together and to maximize our ability to come together. That being said, depending on the program, there are grants that exist that we could apply to, depending on what's happening, whether it's like a state level based grant or a local grant. But there are also national grants for a lot of these programs. So it depends what's happening. I think moving forward, you'll see a lot more around mental health and mentoring. And so I know these exist. I know in the DMV, right, there's an Eritrean mentoring program that exists. I don't know what exists in Washington State. In New York, we don't have a lot of Eritreans here. Most people are transplants. I'm one of the few of us who actually grew up here. And so the community, again, it's different depending on what are the demographics of the community and how long they've been here. But in terms of sustainable funding, I think the real challenge is more so around our own organization overcoming political divides. Because again, should the political divide that exists in Eritrea affect how we organize for our collective benefit here locally? I would argue that it doesn't really matter when we're talking about someone who's just fresh off the boat and needs academic support in their community, right? It doesn't matter whether their parent is pro-government or opposition for that young person who we should be supporting as a community. And so I think that's a challenge. And there was another challenge I was going to mention, but that's the biggest challenge. So I can't remember the other challenge I was going to mention. But I think it's more of an organizational challenge as opposed to really the funding.
Ooh. I can share a little bit about 2 programs that we have in King County that's supporting immigration and education as well. We have a measure that was put on the ballot, Best Starts for Kids, and it was put in place by our county executive to help address a lot of like the inequities that we are seeing in education, and to also just support the county's vision around supporting our youth, families. And it's a 6-year plan, and it got put on the ballot so the residents of King County either, they passed the initiative, it passed, and it invested $80 million in 2019 to go towards community-based organizations, educational organizations that are serving our youth and families. Daycare providers have received Best Start for Kids dollars, but it was a huge investment, $80 million, over $80 million. In 2019, it supported 281 community partners and over 483 programs. And it was just on the ballot in 2020 and passed again. So those dollars are going to continue. We also have in place in King County a legal defense fund, similar to that sort of pot of money you were describing. It basically, it's a partnership between the county, city of Seattle, and a foundation. And they put some, dollars together. It's over $5 million. And those dollars directly go to community-based organizations that have attorneys that are, fighting immigration cases. And they have been able to provide direct service, screenings and assessments, and go to court with individuals, all pro bono, because of that pot of money. And I think it's a really great sort of initiative that was put together. It was designed by the community. It was community-based organizations that really came together and asked, our local government to create this pot. And so really it was also like shaped by the community and centered around their voices and ideas around how these dollars should get allocated. And it's a really simple process. A lot of the times when you're getting county dollars, there's always this, people are worried about the audits and the applications and how, just how painful that process is. And with the legal defense fund, a lot of those hurdles are avoided, and barriers to receiving those dollars. So it's a great program that I encourage, other states to look at and maybe duplicate or create something similar.
Thank you, Hamdi. Yes, go ahead.
Salam, yeah, I just wanted to build off a little bit of what Hamdi was saying, and Dom as well. In my previous role, I worked for a state education agency, the Puget Sound Education Services District, which is the largest education agency in Washington State. And I particularly worked in early learning. And one of the things that we used to say before all of our meetings was an African proverb, and it went like this: if you want to go alone, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And one of the things that I saw was the collective power of our early learning families, who were primarily from low-income backgrounds, disadvantaged communities, immigrant and refugee communities. A lot of our East African communities participated in the Head Start, which is a federally funded preschool program, and our state education program that's the counterpart to Head Start, which is ECAP in Washington State. And I just want to share that sharing your story is powerful and can bring money, dollars to your communities. And I just really want to emphasize that is sharing your story, sharing your successes, sharing your challenges can make a big difference. A lot of these nonprofit agencies or even government agencies will, they'll have like a lobby day in which you can participate and go to your state's capital, and where you can advocate for resources, right? And in particular, in the organization that I worked with, I went with families and accompanied them to meet with their legislators, and they were able to share their stories. We've seen this happen time and time again in our local communities. Even our one of our school districts, Highline School District, in 2017, there was a bill concerning dual language programs in our early learning schools. And families went to, and I think it's such a beautiful story, and I wish I could pull this specific date, but we had families gather from Latino backgrounds, East African backgrounds, and they went to that school board meeting and they spoke in their native tongue. So you had people speaking Tigrinya, Maringa, Spanish to our monolingual board members advocating for resources. And they said, this is how our children feel. This is how we feel when we go into your space, when we walk into our schools. And they really made it clear that, bilingualism, speaking to Andom's point earlier, should be seen as an asset. Culturally responsive services, programming, money for additional resources, like whether it's ethnic programming, learning about the histories and identities of those respective communities is important and should be done in our schools. And so, long story short, that bill passed, and grants were awarded to school districts and community providers, home care, which home care school centers, and now, they're building on that. They're building on those successes and are continuing to improve our dual language programming. Now the school district does a seal of biliteracy and are looking at additional things to do to support our diverse communities, our bilingual students and families. And so I just want to say that sharing your story, whether it's individually or as a collective, is also powerful, and how you can get these resources and ensure that dollars are coming, right? And not just the challenges, but sharing the successes, right? I am the daughter of immigrants. I am a bilingual person, and that is not a deficit, that is a strength. And, sharing those stories. So I just wanted to add to that. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a beautiful story. I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists for your insight, your expertise, and more importantly, your dedication to growing civic engagement. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much. Okay.
كل حلق طيب لدمته صدر قشة وحش تميته تصعر اللقوق تصفى نزحمة وانك حلفة تصعر اللقوق بعقمي قال سيس منابرتين اي كدمي جيزي اقوان تحيلني سعرهم براي سعرني سقمي تصفى يولقفي تصفى يوحيلي دقاقي متسئل كساب سمر اللي يتعام حسن في الشغطة عملي في الشغطة عملي كله تعرف في الشغطة عملي في الشغطة عملي يتعام حسن في الشغطة عملي في الشغطة عملي هاي حلال انكساب سمر اللي في الشغطة عملي سعر براي سعر نمسقمي نبرا كبيدني نمارركو طعنا زي بلو مسرقكو هتصناني عيان نفسي الرقبي يوم نفسي لك وعاب براي كون عددي تتصبي كون تمتصواتي طعنا يغلقان مستدفع مرر مركي وتكسنفا واني النقو اميني زحاسكو حيز السمسكيني في الشغطة عملي كله ترى في الشغطة عملي في الشغطة عملي يدعم يحسن في الشغطة عملي في الشغطة عملي هاي حلال انكساب زي سمر اللي في الشغطة عملي سعر براي سعر نتسقمي سنسكي حبو زعقس يحيال زواهلي لبام يا أخل النبال زفلت وحبتام كبحال السميع تسأمين اللو انت سكت أنانا انت سامامي دحان تحلف يندابلو عيني عابت ومكن ليدي حليف تسفى يولقفي تسفى يحيلي دقاقي متصبي كساب زي سمر اللي يطعم حسن في الشيخ تعمل في الشيخ تعمل كل تريب في الشيخ تعمل في الشيخ تعمل يطعم حسن في الشيخ تعمل في الشيخ تعمل هاي حلالين كساب سخون اللي في الشيخ تعمل سعر مبرعي سعر نتسقمي كل حلف فايل غميته كيلو غشا وحي قميته صعر اللقوم تسفى نزحمة وانت حلفة صعر اللقوم بعقمي كالسس منابرتي لك قدمي قزي وانت حيلني سعرهم براي سعرني تسقمي هو مغان حسب تبالكو صفحاتي وكم استردقو نتتصبق زبالة اللو نتحمق زباء سلو نتتعقني زتعامل لو نتحسب زمرر اللو شافت صبغن حماقن عقينه كلاليو ولا انت فتينه عبي كي كلو انا سبزعني في الشيخ تعامل كل تريف في الشيخ تعامل في الشيخ تعامل يطعم حسام فقك تعامل في الشيخ تعامل هاي حلالين كساب زم السلالي في الشيخ تعامل سعرهم براي سعر نتسقمي عالم كم بحريا كم زبحل كحم بالسيكل نخيط حل حبيرنا لو تسقمنا نكالل كنبال حد زيادة كنقاد سليت شقرت ولدان تقاب بعد كان منفس نراقب هيوات كلم حايش كل لازم تسفى ودقفي تسفى وحيلي دقاقي ما تصير كساب زم السلالي يطعم حسن في الشيخ تعملي في الشتاء عملي كل تراب في الشتاء عملي في الشتاء عملي يطعم حسام في الشتاء عملي في الشتاء عملي هاي حلالين كساب زي سمر الليل في الشتاء عملي سعر مبراي سعر نتسقمي كساب زغونا الليل كساب سمر الليل وكانوا سيعقلي تمتاي هاي عقدني سماي مرت كساب زغونا لي كساب سمر لي هاي تنققني حايلي تصفوي وتمتاي هاي حلال سماي مرت سماي 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 مرت متاي هاي عقدني سماي البرد كساب زغونا لي كساب السمر لي هاي تنطقني حايلي تسفوي وتمتاي هاي حلالي سماي البرد سماي 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 البرد عقلي تصفوي وتأمتي هاي حلالي سماي برتي